Just click the mouse and that'll do it. Just the big button on the computer, if that doesn't work.
Okay. 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 Oh, to the side. I gotcha. Okay. This is a evolutionary theory of socialization that Belsky, Steinberger, and Draper advanced, almost 20 years ago now, which we didn't conceptualize then as what we're talking about today, fast and slow life history strategies. We did conceptualize it as life history strategies. We did in terms of life history theory and in terms specifically of reproductive strategy, and we call them high quality and low quality, or high investment and low investment offspring. Basically arguing that family context, the broader ecological context in which families function, including things like income, marital discord, and the broader social environment, affects child-rearing strategies, and thereby psychological and behavioral development, and very much in line with what AJ was just talking about. We talked about, on the negative side, insecure attachment, mistrustful internal working model, and an opportunistic interpersonal advantage-taking orientation, social, which becomes sexual. On the positive side, secure attachment, trusting internal working model, and a reciprocally rewarding interpersonal orientation, a mutuality. And that, that these two reproductive strategies, which we also could conceptualize potentially as a continuum and not just as distinctive types, would lead on this side to earlier sexual activity, short-term unstable bonds, and limited parental investment, and the opposite over here. Now, importantly to us was that this represented a reproductive strategy. These were not problem behavior outcomes. In other words, from this developmental history and ecological and developmental history, these, if you would, risk-taking, putatively problematical outcomes made perfect biological sense. But you know what? All of that could and still could be explained by traditional psychological theories, be they social learning or attachment. There's no news here that bad environments produce, if you would, less pleasant people who then engage in more risk-taking. So for me as a theorist, the question became, if this evolutionary lens, which I wanted to look through, had any utility, it had to tell me something that traditional theories didn't. And it wasn't until I came up with the idea that these processes would influence somatic development, particularly the timing of puberty and maturation, that I said, here we've got an added value hypothesis. And in fact, plenty of data have come along in the past 20 years. At the very least, it's not inconsistent with this proposition that rearing environments are regulating not only psychological and behavioral development, but thereby somatic development, and with that, on the way to reproductive strategies. Now, and here's just some evidence from a recent study that we've been involved in, studying over 1,000 kids from birth to age 15, and these are girls, showing that harsh mothering in the preschool years predicts earlier age of menarche, even after you've controlled for the potential heritable role of mother's age of menarche, and thereby predicts greater sexual risk-taking, but not other drugs and alcohol risk-taking. So there's just some longitudinal evidence. At the very least, it's not inconsistent with the theory. These data are in press in developmental psychology. Now, many years ago, David Rowe, who used to work here, in fact, I think Bruce has his position, died all too young of pancreatic cancer. David is a behavior geneticist, and he's the only behavior geneticist I know who is really equally steeped in what I would call Mendelian evolutionary thinking and Darwinian evolutionary thinking, because he was really a behavior geneticist with evolutionary psychological orientation. And David, of course, proposed a general behavior genetic challenge. That is to say, in this model that we were advancing and that others were talking about, do we have genetic mediation masquerading as environmental effects? That is, maybe what there are a common set of genes affecting family rearing environments, and also in offspring affecting timing of puberty and reproductive strategy outcomes, be that sexual promiscuity and or unstable pair bonding and or limited parental investment. And that seemed to me a particularly problematic challenge, because all the evidence, and most of the evidence to date, except for the Meany experimental animal evidence, is correlational in nature. So it led me to ask the question, why would natural selection craft an organism whose future functioning is influenced by its earlier experiences? That is, why should early developmental experience matter? And my answer came up pretty simply, which is shaping the future in terms of the past only makes sense if the present is tolerably related to the future, at least within generations and maybe between adjacent generations. And under those conditions, all of a sudden, there would be selective pressures to adjust the early development in anticipation of a later future and thereby affect later environmental influence. That is to say, there should be reproductive strategies that are conditional, as we've been talking about, that go left with left-bearing winds and go right with right-bearing winds and are adjusted through developmental programming, but at the same time, there should be alternative strategies, fixed strategies. So people are going left no matter what, people are going right no matter what. And you have, and so this was a way of, in some ways, addressing the behavior genetic challenge. And it's not either or, nature or nurture. In fact, maybe the answer to the nature-nurture controversy becomes, for some it's nature, and for others it's nurture. And that hedges the bets in the same way that a basic thesis of financial investing is diversify your investments. Put some money in your fixed bond funds, paying 2%, 4% in 10, 20, 30 years, okay? Some money in equities, which will be variable. And except for credit crunch, you should get a maximized payoff. So this led to what I call the differential susceptibility hypothesis. Now, interestingly, working from an evolutionary analysis, Boyce and Ellis and Belsky came to basically the same idea, but through different points of view, which is there should be conditional strategists and alternative strategists, people who future development tax to the wind of early experience and people who it doesn't. Now, the interesting thing is this is a very different framework from a classical diathesis stress model. Because in diathesis stress thinking, in the mental health model, is the view, if we think of environments as ranging from putatively negative to putatively positive, and functioning really mental health-wise from problematical to competent and functioning, in the traditional diathesis stress model, the notion is that some organisms, for temperamental, physiological, or genetic reasons, are vulnerable to adversity. So that is, under good conditions, the red, the would-be vulnerable, and the putatively unvulnerable are no different. But under conditions of ecological risk, the vulnerable succumb. And in fact, much of the gene-environment interaction research has been carried out under this model. But our model is a different one, and that is one of differential susceptibility, that actually these vulnerable are not vulnerable, they're malleable. And so they have a deeper downside under adverse conditions, but they're also the ones who benefit under good conditions. And one of the intriguing things about this framework is it suggests that those who are often conceptualized as resilient, that is, they do not succumb to adversity, are actually not really resilient, they're just not malleable. They don't benefit under beneficial conditions either. They're what I would call fixed strategists. Now, Steve Sumi has produced some wonderful evidence consistent with this, in which he's been able to selectively breed laid-back, low negative reactivity rhesus macaque babies and uptight, highly negative reactive babies and cross-foster them experimentally to nurture incompetent mothers and non-nurture incompetent mothers. And lo and behold, what you get is a dramatic difference in range of reaction, such that the laid-back, low negative infants, how they're cared for doesn't make any difference at all. But the uptight, highly negative infants, it makes a huge difference. And these become the most competent and the least competent, rising to the top of the dominance hierarchy versus remaining in the bottom. Here we have our malleable, here we have our fixed strategists, if you would. I'm going to run through this. What about humans? Well, we have, if we look at the serotonin transporter genes, short alleles are conceptualized as risk alleles, as vulnerability genes, typically for depression. But here's an interesting study that shows, by Shelley Taylor's group, that shows actually if you take those with the short alleles, okay, that's over here, two short alleles, homozygous for the short alleles, that actually, just as expected, when they grow up under high-risk conditions, they show the most depressive symptomology. There's your genetic vulnerability. But lo and behold, look what else happens. Those same putatively vulnerable genotypes under low risk, good family conditions, actually have the least depressive symptomologies. And we've just published a paper in molecular psychiatry and another one in Press in Psychological Bulletin showing that a lot of the GE evidence is consistent with this framework. And intriguingly, the psychiatrists doing much of this work from a mental health model missed their own evidence and their own data. They're looking for vulnerability, and when all of a sudden, unlike Shelley Taylor, they'll have data just like this and they won't notice it. I don't have time to go into such evidence. Here's another study, and here's an example where the investigator didn't capture it. We regraphed it, in which we're looking at low environmental risk and high environmental risk predicting adolescent depression, and lo and behold, those were the short genotypes, on the short alleles on the serotonin transporter gene are highly malleable, doing worst under bad conditions, most depression, doing worst under bad condition, most depression, best under low environmental risk conditions, least depressions, and actually those with the long alleles, that black line is flat. They're unaffected by environmental risk. But I want to suggest that most of the G by E work to date that's consistent with differential susceptibility. And a lot of it, it's hard to know if it's consistent with differential susceptibility because the study designs don't focus upon positive environments. And they don't focus upon competent functioning. A good environment is the absence of adversity, not maltreated. Good functioning is the absence of psychopathology, not depressed. So you're missing a lot of the empirical design space. But one of the things we've thought about is, what if you think beyond single genes? Because, in fact, we've been able to identify at least 5 different genes in the G by E literature that look like they function by what we describe as plasticity alleles rather than vulnerability alleles. That is, they don't simply make people more vulnerable to adversity. At the same time, they look like those people are more likely to benefit on the upside. And we had some data from the Ad Health Project, a large-scale study of American adolescents, and we had, this is Kevin Beaver from Florida State and myself, and we looked at the relationship between a composite measure of parenting predicting self-control in adolescence as a function of whether or not these almost 800 males and 800 females had the plasticity allele for each of these genes. So in other words, an individual could have 5 plasticity alleles or 0 plasticity alleles. We made a cumulative genetic plasticity allele construct. And lo and behold, we were looking for a G by E interaction between parenting and number of plasticity alleles in predicting self-control. We didn't get it for females, but for males, the data, which are hard to see here, are astonishing. When I first got these data, I said to myself, oh, this is what we expected. But it wasn't until 2 days later I said, this is amazing. Because what we see here, for those with 0 or 1 plasticity allele, whether or not you have very poor parenting or very good parenting, it's a flat line. It makes no difference at all. But if you have 4 or 5 plasticity alleles, that's the steepest line in terms of the relationship between quality of parenting and outcome. And as you move down to 2 plasticity alleles, the slope gets less. So we can see here that what we have are, it looks like, individual differences from a genetic perspective in susceptibility to environmental influences, in malleability. And this suggests to me, it's consistent with the conditional alternative reproductive strategy standpoint, but what it suggests to me is that in most of our environmental work, we're both overestimating and underestimating our environmental effects by failing to distinguish the more and less malleable, if you would. Now, I want to make 2 intervention implications and then finish up. The first is that this suggests that if we have limited intervention bucks to deploy, there might someday be some merit in identifying those who are more likely to be responsive to them. In fact, what evolutionary theory may be telling us is that don't expect everybody to be responsive to your efforts to, quote, correct their behavior, whatever that behavior is. That some might be fixed strategists. I mean, we know there are psychopaths who grow up in perfectly fine families. And we know we have kids who grow up in the worst environments who do just fine. They may be our fixed strategists. By the same token, there are others out there who look like they can be, purely pushed around developmentally. And if that's so, if we could target them, we might get more bang for our intervention buck. This raises all sorts of ethical issues, and I don't want to go there right now, but I want to raise those because they're probably worth discussing. At the same time, what I want to do is suggest that if we think of reproductive strategies, timing of maturation, timing of sexual activity, number of pair bonds, parental investment, as something that's regulated by developmental history, at least in the malleable, then it says to me that if that first of all, teenage pregnancy may not be, quote, a social pathology as we're implying, but a strategic response to harsh and unpredictable conditions which lead one to believe that I don't control my destiny, the future is precarious, others aren't going to care for me, so let me make the best of a bad situation. And that may be going to seed early, if you would. But what that suggests to me is that if you want to fight that perhaps evolutionary psychological force, you can't do it with a hand tied behind your back. Just say no, $1 a day program. You have to come to grips with you're wrestling with a strong, powerful selection pressure. So many years ago, when Newt Gingrich was still, in the Congress, I came up with an idea of paying girls not to get pregnant. And in fact, I wrote an editorial submitted to the New York Times titled "New Ideas for Newt." They didn't go along with it, but let me lay out for you here, because it's a strategy for paying people. Let's say starting in 6th grade, you pay girls every quarter of the year. Just go into the nurse's office, you get a visual inspection. Are you visibly pregnant? Now you can't pull that off as a lie for too long. Maybe 1 trimester, 2 trimesters. By the 3rd trimester, game's up. The key feature is that the direct payment that you give girls for not getting payment goes up every year. It may go up every half year. That is, you don't let individuals habituate to payment. We may get great salaries, let's say, but we still want more. Even the people who get really huge salaries still want more because we habituate to whatever it is. So as you see, here's a proposal, 6th grade down to 12th grade, you increase that direct payment $25, $40, $60, $80, $100, $150, $200. But you don't stop there. Because the whole idea here is to induce in these girls a sense that I control my destiny. Because the hypothesis is that much of what's going on here is you're responding to a life in which you haven't had any control. And in fact, you've been induced into believing that you don't have any control. And therefore, you're strategically responding to that ecological reality. So at the same time you get a direct payment, you get a matching escrow payment. And so if you get to the end of high school and graduate, and you don't get pregnant, you get whatever builds up in the escrow account. But I don't want to stop there. Because when I give you your, let's say, $25 this month, and then I say I'm going to put 25 in escrow, I say if you give me up to half of your 25 back, $12.50, I'll double it. And I'll put that in escrow. Because I want to induce in you a future orientation, that you can control your destiny, and your actions today has consequences tomorrow. So all of a sudden, that $25 I get 25 in escrow, I get $12.50 back, it's matched with $12.50. All of a sudden, at the end of the year, I've got $250 in the bank. At the end of the time I graduate from high school, I've got $4,900 in the bank. That's less than the, was it 60,000 you're talking about? And all of a sudden, if you add this up, upon escrow upon graduation, comes out to be actually you don't have, this is the total cost, $4,900. You've got $2,280, let's say $2,300 in the bank with these numbers. There's nothing sacrosanct about these numbers. It might be worth experimenting with these numbers. Okay, you decide you want to go on to higher education, vocational, college, we'll double or triple that money so that you can make an investment. You're in control of your destiny. You can make investments with your resources. They will be matched and you will be rewarded for it. As I said, there's nothing sacrosanct about these numbers. I don't know if they should be higher or lower. I don't know if they should change more variable. I don't know if the escrow account should double or triple the payment. It seems to me these are things we could experiment with. And what I would conclude is compare the cost of this, even across every kid in the high school, in terms of preventing one premature baby in a tertiary care nursery for 3 months. We're talking huge expenditure of money here. And right now we're spending that money in high-risk pregnancies and high-risk births. And so I would argue that this is, an idea that I, came to by saying, this is a battle of the psyche we're running here. One has to change a worldview that has been designed to respond to an environment, at least in the malleable type. So here's an attempt at extrapolating from a view of the development of reproductive strategy that might promote strategically and reasonably early pregnancy and trying to combat that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, great. We have 20 minutes, even according to our schedule, to talk. And we could go a little bit over. So why don't we have a few questions directed at Jay, and then go it open more generally.
Go ahead.
Discussing aspects of both talks. So far, every intervention to look at adolescent sexuality, pregnancy prevention, STDs, has failed miserably, whether it's abstinence only, looking at STDs, looking at whatever, everything has failed. At the beginning of your talk, looking at the risks and benefits, and everything has looked at the risks of adolescent sexuality. Pregnancy, STDs, poor life performance, not going on to college. The risks are unpredictable, probably relatively low likelihood, delayed, vague. We've never looked at the benefits of adolescent sexual behavior, which are rather obvious, immediate, intense, high likelihood of succeeding. We've always looked at risks. We've never addressed benefits in any kind of sexuality education. So, you know, again, looking at ways to prevent, at some point in time when we intervene with teens, we are going to have to address the benefits that they find and comparing the benefit-risk ratio. Thinking further, something like substance abuse. Well, maybe we have risks and benefits that are equal. But I think to most teens, the benefits so far outweigh the risks as to make most of these interventions. Here you're upping the ante on the benefit and trying to equalize benefits.
I'm basically starting with the assumption that there are benefits here. And in fact, you know, I left out a slide.
You're postulating around $5,000 worth of benefit that you're going to pay for.
Yeah, right.
You know, to counterbalance.
You know, I left out the slide I had on Arlene Geronimus has something called, she calls the weathering hypothesis. And Arlene Geronimus' point is, for many of these girls, teenage pregnancy is actually an optimal time to give birth, given what's going to happen to their health as they age, given the absence of social support in a depleted network, perhaps given the fact that their siblings and their cousins are getting pregnant and draining whatever kin resources there are. So that's the battle. I mean, that's the world the girl may live in. That's her unconscious and not conscious, you know, responsiveness. And here we're trying to fight that.
And I would say conscious.
Sometimes it's conscious.
Yeah. Tell me exactly why they want to be pregnant now.
There's no knight in shining armor coming along.
Well, you know, that their older sisters have gotten pregnant, they've gotten on access, they're living in their own apartment, she's still at home with the curfew, she still has a final tomorrow, you know, and very self-consciously telling me, my sister's life is a whole lot better with baby than mine is now. The other quick end is resiliency. Adolescent literature is filled with resiliency factors. Why are some kids, as you said, glowing in adverse environments and others crash and burn in optimal environments? But I've never seen any genetic studies, you know, involved in that, and how that will play out is going to be totally chaotic.
I just want to make a comment just to help integrate this for people, that what he's finding there, which is fantastic, about the malleability things, right, is precisely, I didn't have those data, I didn't see it till now, but precisely what I'm trying to refer to about how it's variance. It's about variance. Malleability is about variance. And all this risk is about variance. And you can call those people risk takers, and they are taking risk. They're betting on that good environment, but then they do poorly in the bad environment. And from those diagrams, it looks like the net payoff appears to be zero, you see? So those people aren't systematically doing better or worse, and that is precisely what we predicted by evolutionary theory of what we call a balanced polymorphism, where there's two genotypes coexisting in exactly the same environment. If one had systematically superior fitness to another, it would easily outcompete the other would go into extinction. But if you have these two forms, right, or possibly multiple forms, since there's so many alleles, but let's just simplify it and say two forms, in the same environment, perhaps even from the same parents, right, they have to have equal fitness payoffs on average, right? So the flat guys and the tilted guys have to have equal fitness payoffs on average, because the environment may be good or bad and you don't know what's going to happen, right? So that's very much in keeping with, standard evolutionary dynamics, and also, a good example of what I'm trying to say is how things get distorted when you overweigh the negative and you disregard the positive. There's a positive here, and if those genotypes did not sometimes lead to positive outcomes, we could fairly confidently predict that they would be extinct by now. Right?
No, yes, sir.
Oh, actually, I wanted to ask you a question before I went back to the other issues earlier, and that is, what is your thought about the handful of polymorphisms that have been identified that you include in these analyses here, your polymorphism? Don't you think it's likely that's a very small subset?
Absolutely.
And so before we would take this to a public health level, would sort of assume we've identified a critical mass of these of the malleability polymorphisms when these are probably just a handful that we've happened upon so far.
In fact, the only reason we have these is because psychiatrists have considered them vulnerability alleles, predicting, disorders, be they conduct disorder or depression or psychosis. So I agree entirely with you. This is just a small possible sampling of it. And if you really could score people from, let's say, 0 to 25, because you had 25 of them, would you even get a sharper set of relations? So yes, I think this is the tip of the iceberg, conceivably.
Right, and I guess it goes back to something that you were pointing out earlier. That is, as a model, it's compelling, and it's intellectually exciting. But if one wants to start arguing at the level of policy and public health, is there risk of jumping in and saying too early, oh, we understand enough of the picture to say which subgroup of people should get the intervention,
right.
Because it fits
It's probably
the
not.
model.
It's probably not too early, I would say, to run experimental trials, which are genotypically informed, and people are actually doing that. And we have plans to do that. We're collecting data to do that. But on a broad population-based level, and even let's say you ran the trials, and let's say they cut nature at the joints, and you had your responders, just as you expected, and your non-responders just as you expected. I would go so far as to say that doesn't stipulate policy, because you may have a value that steps in between your evidence and your theory and your policy, and that value says we treat everybody equal. We're not going to triage an opportunity no matter what the evidence says. In the same way we say smoking kills you, but we're going to let you smoke. We're going to tax you, but we're going to give you the freedom to smoke, at least so far. So I think it's important here that we remain remain clear that the science doesn't have a one-to-one correspondence with a policy implication. Yeah.
I'm Dennis Embry. Sorry for being late, but I got here. So wonderful presentation. And a couple things went through my mind. First off, this is consistent with the study by Madrid and Cummings on the D2 gene and the sort of malleability, possible benefit
Right.
thing. And I think that's very exciting. It's really important, I think, for a public policy thing to shift to this notion that some of these genes are not just, quote, risky genes, but they in fact may have very strong importance in human affairs. The other piece that just struck me as you were speaking, that we have a natural opportunity to analyze some of this with the good behavior game and the Incredible Years long-term experiment I'm a co-investigator at Hopkins on, because we're just getting ready to do the panel of gene sampling, and we have a control condition, and these are all high-risk, quote, high-risk kids that are assigned, but we've got some other kids in that panel. So we could be looking at this, and we can compare the impact of the peer intervention, which is a good behavior game, the Incredible Years, and the control condition on these kids. And we're into the 29th year of life.
Yeah. Well, Judy Hutchings is running Incredible Year trials in Wales. Yeah. And as we speak, we're collecting DNA because, see, our prediction is that you don't only look at the children as malleable, you look at the parent who you're intervening with in a parent education. And so, in fact, my guess is in some of these interventions showing effects, what you have are hyper-malleable dyads. The mother's malleable, she's responding in parenting. The kid's malleable, he's responding in his behavior, and they're driving the whole effect. And you can therefore think of dyads in which both are malleable, neither's highly malleable, only one of them are malleable, and so you get a graded intervention effect. My hypothesis is you will.
One of the things that I would sort of query about this is in the Hopkins trial, the best intervention is not a parenting intervention.
Okay.
It is the actual first-grade intervention, which is a behavior mod essentially for reinforcing
Right.
Self-control and emotional regulation and lack of negative peer potential. And that's, the effect size are probably double.
Right. But that's, and it may be because that's going right to the kid and it's not having to be mediated through
Right.
an affected and not affected mother.
That's true.
David.
As we try to articulate an evolutionary paradigm, basically, to compare with the mental health paradigm, I'm eager to know, how does the mental health paradigm deal with individual differences? We see that the evolutionary paradigm has much to say about individual differences, genetic and otherwise. And I just would like to get a little, anyone here,
Well,
what does the mental health model say about individual differences?
The diagnosis of stress is the mental health model's individual difference response in the main, which is that some individuals, for temperamental, physiological, and/or genetic reasons, are vulnerable. Not that they are malleable. I think what
But there's no theory of individual differences there. There's an acknowledgement.
No, there's a theory of individual differences in responsiveness to adversity. It's not a theory of individual differences.
Well, it's not a theory. It says that there are individual differences. It doesn't say why.
Right.
Am I right about that?
No, fair enough.
Well, actually, that question brings up what I was starting to raise earlier for the break, and that is that I think in order to have a more in-depth discussion about this, I think we may need to go beyond a unitary mental health model. I don't think there is a mental health model out there. I think there are several, and I could criticize many of them, but I don't think it's easy to make a straw man here and say there's a mental health model out there. And then the second thing is, we haven't defined what we mean by risk behavior. And we've lumped, sometimes they've been lumped as if there's one category of risk behaviors. And the difference between a reckless behavior and even in your analyses, a social risk behavior versus other risk behavior. And if we're going to try to get to models that have some value, it seems to me we're going to have to specify what we mean by risk behavior. Obviously, all kinds of risk behaviors are adaptive in many, many ways. But there are certain kinds of extreme risk behaviors that we probably could agree are extremely unlikely to be adaptive. I think there are some risk behaviors, you say, what's self-harm versus other harm? If you talk about a 16-year-old going out and getting drunk and driving sleep-deprived at 80 miles an hour, you'd say, there's a reason self-risk and other risk are correlated, because the real risk is very transparently that way. And I think that, and if you think about smoking and what the real risk is from smoking, it's very different. So, and I think in your model, you identified a very specific set of risks, and you're beginning to model a very specific set. But if we try to say this applies to risk behavior broadly, I think we're likely to get stuck. It may apply to sets or categories of risk, but I can imagine